Good morning. My name is Paul Salem. I'm Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs at the Middle East Institute. And we're very pleased to welcome you to this expert discussion about the ongoing protests in Iran. Since December 28, over 80 cities and towns across Iran have seen protests against economic injustice and corruption, but also against government policies that put expenditure on foreign military interventions ahead of domestic needs. Media reports tell us that at least 22 Iranians have died and nearly 1,000 have been arrested in the forceful response by state security forces. Some leaders in Iran's clerical government and the Revolutionary Guard Corps have responded by tarring the protesters as tools of foreign agents. At the same time, many foreign leaders and media commentators have claimed that the events indicate a challenge to the Islamic government as well as a rejection of its adventurous foreign policy. We intend, with today's discussion, to get a bit more granular, to take you closer to what's driving Iranians into the streets, and to assess realistically what results their protest might have. To do that, we have a panel of 4 experts who read and interpret Iran's domestic press, official pronouncements, tweets of protesters, and a broad range of original real-time sources. You can find their work, among other places, on MEI's website, including the pages of the Iran Observed project at MEI. You can find them also in the reporting of the Voice of America and in many US and international outlets. I want to welcome and thank Mr. Mohammad Tahir, who's here with us today, and his colleagues at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for proposing this event. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is co-sponsoring this MEI event for the first time. We look forward to future collaborations, Mohammed. This event is being recorded for posting on the MEI website as video and audio, so we ask you please silence your mobile phones. We do encourage tweeting and ask that you use the hashtag IranObserved. Leading our discussion will be Washington Post foreign affairs writer Ishaan Tharoor. He joins us now for the second time as a panel moderator. The previous occasion was last May. Ishaan has reported for over a decade from Washington, New York, and Hong Kong, previously with Time magazine before joining the Post. We are delighted that he accepted our invitation, particularly as we reached him just as he was returning to DC from his honeymoon. So congratulations, Ishaan. His bio and those of our panelists are in the flyer that you picked up as you came in. Ishaan will introduce the panelists as he starts the conversation. We're delighted that you joined us and that you in the audience have all turned out. Ishaan, will lead a discussion with the panelists, and then we will leave ample time for your Q&A, and we end promptly at 11:30. Please welcome Ishaan and our panel, and let's get started.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to the Middle East Institute. I think Paul gave us a very handy preamble to what we're discussing, which is an incredibly fascinating, incredibly complicated set of events in the past few weeks. And I'm very delighted to be here to moderate this panel with a bunch of terrific and very interesting speakers on Iran. So let me quickly introduce them. On the screen to my left is Golnaz Esfandiari. She's a senior correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Central Newsroom, and editor of the award-winning Persian Letters blog. Her reporting and analysis on Iran has been cited in numerous publications in the West, from the New York Times to the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, and others. And she's a frequent commentator on media in the US and the West on matters relating to Iran. She has worked as a consultant in the past for the Freedom House, authoring several reports on human rights and press freedom in Iran. And in 2013, she was tagged for the 3rd year in a row as Foreign Policy's top 100 Twitterati list. To my left is Negar Mortazavi. She's the Washington correspondent for Iran International and a commentator for BBC, CNN, and other TV outlets. She was named a global young leader in 2017 by Friends of Europe, and as well as Golnaz, she is among the top. The Guardian listed her as among the top 10 people to follow on Twitter for Iran news. We have a very, very esteemed Twitterati panel here, I suppose. To my right is Ahmad Majidyar, director of the Iran Observed project at Middle East Institute. He's a fellow here, and from 2008 to 2015, Ahmed worked as a senior research associate at AEI, where he co-authored 2 monographs on Iran. He's published a number of other papers elsewhere, and has also worked in his capacity with the Naval Postgraduate School of Leadership Development, as well as other projects with the government. And lastly, but not least, Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow of Middle East Institute, somebody I bother a lot on the phone now and then when I want to know what's happening in Iran. He's a Senior Fellow here. He specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. From 2006 to 2010, he was a managing editor of Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst. And the rest of the bios are there. So let's get into the conversation because we have a lot to talk about. So Golnaz, who cannot see us, but and I can't see myself, let's turn to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I was wondering if you could set the stage for us about what's happened in the past few weeks in Iran. What prompted these protests? How did they unfold? And what do you take away from it, covering it from afar?
Thanks, Ishaan, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I want to speak very briefly about why I think these protests are significant, and I think they're a warning to the rulers in Iran. We've seen in the course of the past years protests in Iran, limited protests. We've seen strikes by workers. We've seen protests by teachers. We've seen protests in front of the prison, every prison in Tehran, by the followers of the jailed healer, by dervishes and others. But they've been limited. They haven't spread. What is very significant about this protest is that they spread very quickly to some 80 cities across Iran, we had never seen anything like this before. They were, I think, initially fueled by economic grievances, by corruption, unemployment, high prices, but they quickly shifted to demonstrations against the Iranian establishment, against Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That's the last say in the Islamic Republic. What was very interesting, I thought, is that the fear factor was gone. Because, in Iran, if you protest, you risk your life. You risk getting detained, and being charged and tortured. And, we saw more and more people taking the risk to come to the streets and just chant death to Khamenei and against other Iranian rulers, and saying that they don't want an Islamic Republic and they want an Iranian Republic. And also they were protesting against Iran's policies in the region, namely its support for Bashar al-Assad, saying, focus on us instead of spending the money in Syria and other countries. There was a powerful video, it was from Tabriz, a city in northwest Iran, and it was recorded by a woman. We couldn't see the woman, we could hear her voice. And she was saying, look, today there's no protest. The city has been, is under the control of security forces, and we could see police forces everywhere. And she said, but now they're even afraid of our silence. So I thought that was very powerful. And it was a warning for Khamenei and other Iranian leaders. Another cause of concern for Khamenei and other people in Tehran, authorities, is that the people who took to the streets were from the working class. They were very poor people, angry young men, who have no hope in the future, who have nothing to lose. And basically many of them were protesting against the promises, the broken promises of the 1979 revolution. We spoke with a protester who said his father was a supporter of the revolution, and he said, he would tell us how the founder of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, promised us free electricity, free water, free housing, but look, like 4 decades later, we live in misery. Another important issue is, and I think we hadn't seen that before, is that many of the protesters seem to be fed up not just with the conservative faction of the Islamic establishment, but also with the reformists. You know, one of their chants was like, "We don't want you anymore. We don't want the conservatives. We don't want the reformists." And it goes against what we've been hearing from people from the middle class who, you know, say, "We don't want another revolution. We don't want regime change. We just want evolution." But that was different. It seems that there are people out there who basically think that reforms are not the way to go. So that's another warning for rulers in Iran. And my last point is that these protests again highlighted that Iran has mastered the art of repression. Iranian authorities have now repressed several important protests in the country, one in 1999, 2009, and now. But the lesson is that, you know, repression doesn't help permanently because the frustration is there, the anger is there, and this is not going to make it go away. And I think what we saw in these protests is that the society is underneath is boiling.
Thank you, Golnaz. If I can ask, given the fact that you're out of the country, can you tell us a bit about your experience trying to cover the protests and the nature in which you have your communications with Sunni Iranians in Iran?
So we speak usually on a daily basis to many Iranians in the country. Since 2009, it's been getting more difficult. People are afraid because, you know, people have been charged for speaking to us. Before, we would use to call people. Now they usually don't want us to call them, so it's usually via different communications application. So Telegram has been one of the main tools that I've been talking to people, or Facebook Messenger, depending. But Telegram is extremely popular, and one of the main things that the Iranian authorities did when the protest started, they blocked Telegram. But even after it was filtered in Iran, we could speak to some people who would use VPNs, you know, to access Telegram. I think one lawmaker said that 40 million Iranians were using Telegram, and after the filtering, the number dropped to 25 to 30. So still, people were able to use it. We also received lots of videos from Iran. I mean, that was also tricky because some of the videos, you know, you have to check. It was difficult. So sometimes we had to call people in those cities, ask whether there's really a protest going on. But there were also fake videos making the rounds. So I think I saw one video that, you know, people, I think they said it's from Tehran, and I saw people wearing like T-shirts, and it's winter, it's cold, so you know it's very difficult to contact people. But you know, because we are one of the few platforms where people can express themselves freely, there are some people out there who are willing to take the risk and send us videos and speak to us and give us information and send us pictures. So that was one of the ways we would get information about what's happening in the country.
Thank you, Golnaz. If I can ask you one more question before I turn to the panel here. There were reports that the protests were first provoked by hardline forces opposed to President Rouhani. Do you give credence to these reports? And why would they want to... Sorry, so do you believe that the reports were first instigated by hardline forces in Mashhad opposed to Rouhani? And why would they want to start these protests?
It seems that that's how it happened from the information we've received, and even some of the Iranian officials have said that today one lawmaker, he's a conservative, Ali Motahari, is very outspoken. He also said that it seems that the protest started in Mashhad by hardliners. He said by the Hezbollahi, which is the hardliners in Mashhad. There were also, the New York Times said that there were rumors that the hardline cleric Ayatollah Alamul Khoda, who's the Friday prayer leaders of Mashhad, was summoned by the Supreme National Council in the country, and the New York Times had a source confirming that report. So it seems that this is how it started. It was supposed to be a protest against President Rouhani. From his opponent, Alamul Khoda has been against Rouhani. He's been protesting against his cultural policies. You know, for example, he's been banning concerts in Mashhad. despite attempts by the culture ministry to hold concerts around the country. Mashhad had been banned. So it seems that's how it happened, but it got out of control. And even Alam al-Huda, who's someone, he's not very much into recognizing people's rights. He doesn't care about people in general. He somehow acknowledged that people had the right to protest, but that some of their chants were not okay, especially I think he mentioned the one about Syria. So I think, yes, but it got out of control and it basically spread to the whole country like wildfire.
Great, thank you. So I'll turn to Negar, who's on my left. Negar, I think more than any other journalist based in the United States, does an incredible job spotlighting through social media voices in Iran. Can you talk a bit, similarly to Golnaz, about what in your mind instigated these protests and what they represent right now in the current political moment in Iran?
Just to follow up on what Golnaz was saying, when I speak to reformist activists, specifically on the ground, there's this understanding that the protest started in the city of Mashhad, which is the base for Alam al-Huda, and also Ibrahim Raisi, one of Hassan Rouhani's main rivals in the previous election, just six months ago. And it started as an economic protest with really radical slogans against Rouhani. Death to Rouhani was one of the main slogans. But it just seems like the conservatives underestimated the level of dissent, the deep layers that this type of dissent goes all the way to. And when the opening or the, I would say the environment opened up for this level of dissent, then as Golnaz was saying, the slogans went all the way up to the supreme leader, to Ayatollah Khamenei, death to dictator, which is also another code for the supreme leader. And the protesters are now targeting the entire establishment. And it's not the economy anymore. It is political, it is social policies, even environmental policies. There's drought, there's shortage of water in some areas, there's serious air pollution in certain cities where you even see them in the protest. And also the fact that the protest, like Golnaz was saying, spread like wildfire literally to dozens of cities across Iran, even more number of cities when we compare it to the 2009 mass movement. That just also seems like the role that social media has played in helping mobilize and organize these protests, which had been going on for months, if not years, but mobilize them all at the same time and also get attention, national and international attention for people's grievances. But the conservatives, it seems like when it got out of hand, the conservatives started to try to blame it on something outside of their base, the enemy, the Iran's, the foreigners, or whoever. But these are genuine grievances that people have had for a long time, quite frankly. And this has been a platform for them to vent their anger.
There's been a lot of commentary about the fact that the protests didn't really take root among sort of the more, I wouldn't use the word secular, but I think you understand, the more urbane middle classes in a city like Tehran, for example. Is that, first of all, is that line of commentary true? Because that's been what we in the Western media have been saying about these protests. And secondly, what does that mean? I mean, why didn't it become a huge? I mean, if it's taking root, protests are flaring in 80 cities across the country. What is the symbolism of the fact that Tehran itself wasn't a big center of protest?
So in 2009, if you all remember, the election protest or the Green Movement that came after the presidential election, the second term of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, we saw millions as far as protesters on the street. And I would say the main difference so far that we've been understanding compared to these protests is that the political elite, I would like to call them, are not leading these protests. These protests are basically mass protests. Sometimes you even see people, as far as mobilization and organization, coming from social media without real leadership or direction. They literally show up on the street and then they're on their own. 2009, it was very different. There were political parties. There were established dissident groups who've been active for decades in the country, who led the protests, who were organizing, who were issuing statements, and it evolved around a presidential election, which is the most political event in Iran every 4 years. The environment becomes very political. There's a lot of participation. And so that sort of leadership, or the core of those protests, and also an emphasis on nonviolence. There was very strong emphasis on nonviolence in 2009, which I believe led to a lot more people from the urban middle class, especially Tehran, to feel comfortable to join the protests. So one of the main visuals that we see as far as difference between these two protests is the presence of women. In 2009, you saw a lot of women, young women, who were on the front lines. This time around, you don't see as many women. The presence is not as strong as it was in 2009. Some attribute that to the radical slogans, to the atmosphere, to the higher risk. But it just seems like this time around, these are people who've been disenfranchised, they're angry because of a lot of different reasons. They might be from different classes. It could be a student who has just finished a master's degree from university and can't find a job and is basically living in poverty now. But it seems like this time around, people have much less to lose, and therefore they're risking a lot, literally putting their lives in their hands, joining the streets. And like Golnaz was saying, there's been serious crackdown. This is even more repressive than 2009. If you look at the time frame, they literally cracked it down within 2 weeks, and the Iranian security forces have become more and more experienced in doing such things.
There's a tendency in the city to sometimes discount the nature of political divisions within Iran. You have a segment of people here who say that, this is all window dressing for a theocratic dictatorship. But given the nature of the protest origins, the fact that a lot of the people protesting were not your sort of Rouhani voters who have brought Rouhani to power in 2 elections, do the protests say something particular about the kind of polarization or increasing differences emerging in the Iranian political system?
So I think the divisions within the political structure in Iran are real. If you speak to reformists who've paid a very high price for being reformists or moderates in the system, it will make it a little more clear. But as far as the political divisions of the protesters, it is still difficult to find out, because they might be Rouhani voters who didn't benefit from the post JCPOA, the nuclear deal era, or the post-sanctions era, which you see across all classes. There might be middle classes who've been affected by fraud, by corruption, by all sorts of inequality, if you don't know the right person, if they don't have the right government job. So it could be a mix of people, but at the same time, we shouldn't forget that Hassan Rouhani, who is considered a moderate within the Iranian establishment, just came into power for a second term 6 months ago. And in a way, if you look at it, voting for Rouhani, who's considered the furthest candidate from what the supreme leader finds desirable, which was Ebrahim Raisi, this candidate in Mashhad, that was the belief, the white belief, that he was supreme leader's favorite candidate this time around. And when the urban middle class, or the political elite, as I call them, participate, some even see that as a form of dissent through reform, through nonviolent means, but it is a sign that the majority, I would say, the majority of the population wants change in the political, economic, social, even environmental policies of the government. But the methods they're willing to take to bring that change varies all the way from millions of people who participate in election to people who've just literally had it and they don't feel like there's any other way for them to vent their anger, and you see them being killed on the streets.
Great. Actually, Alex, if I could turn to you first. Both Rouhani and the Supreme Leader Khamenei have said that we have to take these protesters' demands seriously. Tell us a bit, how much of a jolt to the system of the Islamic Republic were these protests?
Thank you, Ishaan. I want to go back again to Mashhad. As we heard before, we still really don't know what happened. We still don't know what happened. Was it Rouhani's rivals, Raisi and his father-in-law, Ayatollah Hoda, that were behind it? Might have been the case, because one of the things about Mashhad was the slogans were against Rouhani specifically, not the regime. And as soon as this thing got out of control, the first place that settled down was Mashhad, which suggested that there was some control behind the scenes, that whoever was behind it realized, okay, get the guys back home now. Enough is enough. Obviously, the rest of the country experience has been very different once this thing had gotten out of hand. The head of the Revolutionary Guards commander, Mohammad Ali Jafari, pointed signaled that it was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad circle that was behind it. Again, you can debate it. Ahmadinejad has been saying for weeks and months that he's going to hit back against Khamenei for what he feels to be unjust treatment that he's getting handed down, including the 63-year sentence that was just given to his advisor Hamid Baghai. But let's just put all that aside. That's just speculation on our part. What is important, either way, whatever happened, in terms of who might have instigated the unrest or the reaction that came out of it, tells us one thing. There are some real serious splits within the Islamic Republic. That's the headline. And they seemingly, to me, are unable to control it the way they have done for the last 40 years, which takes me, I guess, to a point that I think is very important for all of us Iran watchers to look after, and ties to some of the things Negar and Golnaz have already been saying. The opposition in Iran is as radical as I've ever seen it, covering Iran daily for the last 20 years. You know, Negar just mentioned women not having been at the forefront. The youth were primarily young men in the countryside. This is not the traditional political opposition that the Islamic Republic's known how to deal with. This is a new animal for them. And they might have been successful cracking down, and I agree, they did a good job. In 10 days, about 24 people killed. Compared to what happens in the rest of the Middle East, this was an effective crackdown. But that should not warm their hearts, because what it also tells us is that this is now a wave that's going to continue coming, and the wave's going to get bigger unless you got some kind of economic magic or silver bullet, something that comes in and creates jobs on a scale of millions, which is not going to happen anytime soon. I know oil's gone up to $70 a barrel, but that's not enough for millions of jobs being created. So as I look at it, Ishaan, in terms of what lesson would I draw from this? If I am Ayatollah Khamenei, who's been the steward of this regime for about 30 years now, who do I have to blame but myself? Because one of the reasons there's so much anger built within the system, it's not just because they don't have jobs, it's also because they don't have opportunities to politically express themselves. We had 20 years ago, if you go back to the late 1990s, you had a genuine reformist movement in Iran that genuinely had ways of expressing public anger in the Iranian parliament. But thanks to the stranglehold that Khamenei has through the filters within the regime, who can run for office, what sort of legislation can be passed through the entity called the Guardian Council and other agencies, he's taken all the air out of the room. That's Khamenei who's done that. So what has happened is resulting in those radical slogans. So there's a new generation of young Iranians today who in 2009 would have been 11, 12, 13 years old, who have given up on the idea of gradual reform in Iran, who believe radical way is the only way forward. That's the danger for the Islamic Republic. Khamenei, who will turn 79 this year, he'll pass this on to whoever is going to take over. Now, Rouhani can whisper in his ear and say, my good sir, you need to listen. We need to make serious concessions here to the opposition. I'm sure that is where Rouhani wants to go. He's already started hinting at it. But here's the problem with Rouhani. Nobody really believes him. The hardliners don't believe him. Certainly the people on the street level don't believe him. He's a player, and everybody knows what he wants to do. He wants to be the next Iranian supreme leader. So he's cutting deals with Khamenei in order to get the top job, not necessarily to deliver the goods for the people on the street level. And I think that's the tragedy of Iran today, because this is not the promise of the Islamic Republic if you go back to 1979. The promise was something very different. So today, despite all these elections that are being held, what you see in the streets of Iran is these elections are meaningless. Our voices are not being heard. And I think, talking about jolting the system, I don't think of anything else that can jolt the system any greater than this message for a generation of revolutionaries who are, as I said yesterday, are either dead or dying, who created this system back in 1979, but are now passing on something very different than they sold to the Iranian people in 79. They're passing on something that is more of a fascist religious state than anything else that might resemble a representative model.
So when Rouhani and Khamenei say they have to address these protests, address their demands, are there any tangible things that you see this regime doing?
If you're a radical opposition member in Iran, what are the key things you want to see happen? You want to get rid of the Guardian Council, the unelected 12 members that sit there in their offices and decide who can run for office, what legislation is to be implemented, what legislation should not be implemented, and who do they answer to? They answer to that guy called the Supreme Leader, who, by the way, is not directly elected by the people either. So if you want to make constitutional changes, get rid of something like the Guardian Council. But that would be tantamount to something very radical, which I don't think see Khamenei go for any time soon. In fact, I think Khamenei is more likely to bring about the downfall of the Rouhani government, blame everything on him, as he has done with Ahmadinejad since Ahmadinejad left office, and then hope for another good day to follow. But I just think these are just baby steps that are not going to fix the fundamental, deep problems that the country is facing. And I mean, the numbers are out there. Again, you heard about the environmental issues, the job creation issues. Nobody's talked about so far this morning about corruption. This is by far the biggest problem of the system. A system that's a theocratic system that claims to do God's work on the planet is full of corruption, and you can't hide it anymore. You know, your average Iranian senior official holding 35 different positions, drawing salary from everyone. I mean, just imagine how that goes down in places like Hamadan, Lorestan, Isfahan, some of these border provinces with Iraq with unemployment rates of 70, 80%. That new generation, they're not going to just sit there and listen to a cleric come up and talk about foreigners being behind everything. They want to see change, and that's the challenge.
Terrific. So, Ahmed, you follow Iran's role in the wider region, the Middle East, and one of the more fascinating wrinkles in the story of the protests was the shadow of Iran's role in Syria, in particular, the kind of commitments that an organization like the IRGC has made in the war there, the loss of blood, the commitments of treasure, Iranian funds there. Talk a bit about the role that Iran's foreign policy has played in sort of underlying these protests.
Sure. Thank you, Ishaan. And it's a pleasure to be with this excellent panel to discuss a very timely topic. In addition to some of the internal dimensions that of the protests that other speakers spoke about, some of the slogans that were widely chanted by the protesters against the Iranian regime's foreign policy showed that Iran's very costly involvement in regional conflicts has taken a political toll now in Iran. Although the economic grievances that other speakers spoke about were the key drivers of the protests, but protesters were at the same time questioning the wisdom of their government's billions of dollars in regional conflicts and also financial, very generous support for state and non-state actors across the region at the expense of domestic priorities when the Iranians are economically struggling. And I think that one of the triggers of these protests was Rouhani's budget that he made it public in December. And that showed that an increase for example, for IRGC's budget. It was about $8 billion. And also, at the same time, very generous allocations for other military and religious institutions at the time that the same budget was increasing the prices for fuel and other services in the country. But the question is that whether these protests will change Iran's regional posture. I would say not in the short term, because the Islamic Republic has invested greatly over the past 4 decades to expand its ideological and political sphere of influence across the region. And they will not just change that suddenly because of the demands of the protesters. And if you look at Supreme Leader Khamenei's latest very lengthy speech, although he sympathized with some of the grievances, economic grievances of the protesters, he defended Iran's regional involvement in the region, and he described that in his own words as a key instrument of national power, because it's not just about the export of the revolution. Iran sees its military presence across the region also as a deterrence against Israel, against other regional rivals, and most importantly, against the United States. So that will continue. Having said that, and I think that other speakers were right, that although the protests are fading, the underlying anger and frustration will continue, and they will manifest themselves in different ways. So even if the unrest continues in different parts of Iran in a smaller scale, that will put pressure on the IRGC and other government institutions to focus more on internal issues and that will make it more difficult and more expensive to sustain their very broad regional engagement. And another important thing is also that these protests happen at a time that the Iranian leaders, especially the IRGC leaders and the clerics, they were boasting about becoming the winner, in their own words, in the region, having succeeded, defeated ISIS in Iraq, and also rescuing the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Right now, Iran is arguably the most influential player in those two countries. And at the same time, they were saying we fought these enemies abroad, and we turned Iran into an island of stability. The island of stability was initially used by the Shah before '79, but now the Iranian leaders use that. So these protests, that shows both to Iran's enemies and friends in the region a different image of Iran. And Iran that is vulnerable, that is still fragile, and that is not as strong as it may seem. So that will encourage its rivals in the region. At the same time, it will hurt its prestige in the eyes of many of its proxies.
So building off of that then, as you say, if these protests give encouragement to Iran's many rivals in the region, in the Gulf, Israel, etc., are we heading towards a period of more volatility and instability geopolitically as well?
I think that is possible, at least in the short term. Although, if you see some of the discussions and narratives in Tehran, they say that, well, we've won in Syria and Iraq, so it is time to consolidate our gains. If you look at Iraq, for example, the Popular Mobilization Forces, now they're gearing up for elections. They want to just transform their military gains into political gains and become a major political force in the country. Similarly, in Syria, we see that Iran is trying to establish a very long-term military presence in the country. So it wouldn't like to take the path of confrontation with regional rivals or with the United States that would harm Iran's long-term interest. But at the same time, another aspect which I found very interesting in Khamenei's speech was that he threatened to retaliate against the United States and its regional allies because of their alleged role in Iran in the latest unrest. They said that you have inflicted damage to us and we will do the same. So it remains to be seen whether Iran will take some course of actions against US interests or against its rivals in the region. And indeed, Iran does have the capability to do some damage. It still has it's still supporting and sponsoring a wide range of militia forces in Iraq. It still has ties with Taliban and other militant groups in Afghanistan. And it can increase potentially just its financial and military support to Houthis in Yemen. It can even increase its destabilizing role and support for some militant groups in Bahrain. So it has those assets that it can just mobilize and take in the region. But that remains to be seen because there are differences within Iran that how to, even if they retaliate, that they should do it now or more in a measured way in the long term.
At least on the level of rhetoric, there is some clear tension between a figure like President Rouhani and the Revolutionary Guards. He said things against them during his election campaign, and he's made statements that can be interpreted to be barbs against Rouhani right now. I mean, not against the Revolutionary Guards right now. Could you talk a bit about that tension? Either you or Alex, whichever one of you guys wants to talk about it. And how real is the dynamical rivalry between a figure who's a perceived centrist like Rouhani and an institution that is as powerful and influential as the Revolutionary Guards?
Okay, I'll comment very quickly so Alex can chime in as well. Iran's regional policies are predominantly devised and implemented by the IRGC and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. So President Rouhani and his government, they do have influence and a role in devising and implementing those policies, but not so much. So the tension has always been there. For example, we saw that when, for example, the new ambassador to Syria, Foreign Minister Zarif wanted his own person, IRGC wanted his own person, and similarly in Iraq, For example, it's the third Quds Force member who is ambassador to Iraq. So actually, it's the Quds Force who's running Iran's foreign policy in Iraq, not Iran's foreign ministry. So the tension has always been there, but the problem is that the Rouhani government does not have the tools and influence to significantly change the Islamic Republic's regional policies.
You know, Ishaan, that's a very difficult question to answer, the relationship between Rouhani and the Revolutionary Guards. But as you pointed out, it's certain that there's a lot of animosity between the two camps, if you will. I mean, this is a time, the first anniversary of the death of Ayatollah Rafsanjani a year ago. If you remember Rafsanjani, he was famously known in this town as the middle-of-the-road extremist, who nonetheless was the mentor of Rouhani in many ways. And Rouhani has just reopened the file about how Rafsanjani died last year. Now, again, I don't want to walk into the realm of conspiracy. I don't have the data, but perceptions matter. And Iranian media are full of the idea that who would have wanted to get rid of Rafsanjani at the age of 82 when we're moving towards the idea of succession? Khamenei is getting older too, although he was younger than Rafsanjani, but a lot of people thought Rafsanjani was in better shape. So maybe somebody had an incentive to get rid of him, and that maybe, if you had to point to anybody, would be the intelligence branch of the Revolutionary Guards. I'm speculating here, but I'm saying to you, this is one big part of the discourse inside Iran. So that's the perception people have about the Revolutionary Guards. Revolutionary Guards was created back in March of 1979 for the sole purpose of keeping this regime intact. So they've had, as you've heard before, they've had many cases in the late 80s, in the late 90s, in 2009 to come out and repress when there are people in the streets, and they're good at that. But Revolutionary Guards is much bigger than that. Revolutionary Guards has become the third force in the Islamic Republic. Rouhani's re-election in May 19th, when he got 24 million votes, was really based on the simple promise he made to those millions who voted for him, oftentimes reluctantly. The promise he made was, I'm going to push back against the Revolutionary Guards. I'm going to push back against some of the things they do at home. Ahmad talks about what they're doing in the region, which is all true. But let's not forget what they're doing at home. I don't know if the statistic is true, but certainly it's circulating in Iran. 70% of construction projects in big metropolitan Tehran in the hands of Revolutionary Guards companies. This is the force that IRGC has become. And when you become that big, you are going to create enemies for yourself, and God knows they have plenty of enemies. Rouhani's approach to Revolutionary Guards after May was, instead of delivering to the masses who voted for him, he turns his back towards the masses. And he said, thank you, as maybe good politicians ought to do. I got re-elected for a second time. There is no third time for me, because constitutionally there will be no opportunity for him to run again. But he could go for the position of the supreme leader. Who is more instrumental for that kind of scenario to happen? Not the reformists on the street level, who already have voted for him, so they can be forgotten. Then he turns towards the Revolutionary Guards. He, in my view, takes a shift towards the far right. Hopes for coexistence with the Revolutionary Guards, but he fails because the Revolutionary Guards have never really warmed up to Rouhani. And I say this as well, because I mentioned Rafsanjani. Back in late 1988, Ishaan, after the end of the Iran-Iraq war, the mentor, Rafsanjani, turned around and said to the generals of the Revolutionary Guards, the war with Iraq is over. You guys don't need to be as armed as you used to be. We'll find alternative opportunities for you. He was trying to disband IRGC to a large extent. That was Rafsanjani's goal back then, 30-some years ago. They stood up and said, hell no. That's not going to happen. That's the IRGC. And these same people who said hell no 30 years ago, when they were in their 30s, now in their 60s, Muhammad Ali Jafari, Qasem Soleimani, and all the rest of them at the top leadership of IRGC, they are fearful that they're going to be the biggest victims of any Rouhani-instigated reform. And that's why they're pushing back. And Rouhani's challenge, as I said, is to figure out how to outmaneuver them. He tried to co-opt them, hasn't worked out so far. Maybe these protests will give the Revolutionary Guard generals new ideas to think about. Because as Ahmad might be right, maybe they are going to ship more foot soldiers out there to the region. But let's not forget how risky that is. Because whenever you send somebody out there to fight for Assad in Syria, you're leaving a space empty back home. What are you going to do at a very critical time? As I said, succession could happen next week, could happen 5 years from now on, But whoever's controlling the guns will have a lot to say about who will be the next Iranian supreme leader if they end up having a supreme leader, because there might be a chance where they get rid of that office entirely. But anyway, let me
Can
stop
I
there.
quickly just add
Sure.
something, Ishaan? I think that Alex raised an important point about the IRGC's role in the Iranian economy, because according to many analysts, the IRGC is controlling more than a third of the Iranian economy and is dominating very key sectors like construction, energy, telecommunication, and others. So the IRGC, even the in response to your question, that even President Rouhani, for example, cuts back the funding for the IRGC in the budget from 8 billion to 4 billion and 2 billion. The IRGC has very diversified sources of revenues through both licit and illicit activities inside Iran and abroad. So it can still fund its regional activities, regardless of what Rouhani wants or not. And that is a key factor. And that's also one reason that the US government is increasing sanctions against the IRGC companies. But those sanctions could be more, have more impact if they have the support of the Europeans and other allies, because much of Iran's business is not with the United States, mostly just with the Europeans and Asian countries.
I'm glad you brought the U.S. into it, because we've not mentioned yet the very noisy, the noises made by the Trump administration in the early weeks of the protests. Vice President Pence, in the pages of my newspaper, wrote a very provocative column trumpeting this administration's leadership on the question of Iran and human rights compared to the Obama administration. Golnaz, I'm sorry we've left you alone for a while, but could I ask you, what did the noises made by the White House and the strong statements and tweets from Trump have any impact, or what kind of impact did they have on the protests in Iran?
I think maybe very limited impact. And there's no way to measure the impact of those tweets. But I think in general, you can't expect the U.S. and other countries to be silent when the government of Iran is using force against some people who just take to the streets to protest against corruption and other problems, against repression. I don't think it's helpful for the U.S. to encourage people, to incite people to take to the streets. But I spoke to protesters. They want to see some kind of like moral support. I think the U.S. has to condemn the violence against protesters. I think the European countries have been mainly silent, and I think that's not what people want to see. But at the same time, whatever the U.S. says or doesn't say, Iranian leaders are going to say, these protesters are agents of America. That's what they said, that this protest, that the U.S., the CIA, Mossad, and Saudi Arabia, and also an Iranian opposition group, which is cultish and doesn't have any support, were behind these protests. So it doesn't matter. But I think the U.S. has to condemn the violence against protesters, the state repression. You can't expect the U.S. to stay silent. People are still criticizing President Obama for not being too forceful when the 2009 protest happened, even though he did condemn the violence then.
Negar, if I can ask you, today, and you in particular, are expecting a Trump announcement
Any minute.
on any moment now, or at least later today, I'm not sure exactly when, on whether this administration will continue extending waivers on sanctions on Iran related to the nuclear deal that Trump so clearly detests. Talk a bit about sort of what are Iranians following what's happening here in terms of the conversation about the Iran deal, about the nuclear deal, and do they have a strong opinion about how Trump is handling the situation?
Yes, so we are expecting that announcement anytime today, and millions of people in Iran also are expecting. I wanted to point out the fact that President Rouhani, in his first election and also in the second, ran on the mandate of resolving the decade-long nuclear standoff, and maybe even put too much emphasis on it on the post-Iran deal era, on the post-sanctions era. Some might even say he put all his eggs in the Iran deal basket, and the economic expectation that was made to the population was not what people are seeing today. It's been more than 2 years since the Iran deal was enacted, and the internal mismanagement of the economy, the corruption, the inequality, which is not just bound to the administration of President Rouhani. It's a lot of it are also holdovers from the Mahmoud Ahmadinejad era. All of these have also contributed to the fact that the post-sanction economy of Iran has not worked for many parts of the population. But also, we shouldn't forget the role of the U.S. Like Ahmad was saying, most of the Iranian businesses are looking towards Europe and towards other countries for opening up and for investment. But the U.S. sanctions are still casting a shadow, even if the president signs sanctions waivers today for another 4 months. The sense of uncertainty that he's created, that he might just not sign these waivers, he might just unravel this deal every 3 months, every 4 months, where he has to make that decision. That has cast a shadow on the decision of the Europeans, on the investors, on the companies who are looking into Iran for long-term business and engagement as a market, as a large market that's opening up to the world. So that's also something that is contributing to the factor, and it's frankly put Rouhani or the moderates in a difficult position. They made these promises to their constituency, which is his biggest strength. But then at the same time, the conservatives, those who were against the deal, are actually using it against him. So I think Rouhani at this moment has to play smartly. Basically, either this situation will turn into something against him, or he can use it to turn it as a strength to have a higher bargaining chip against the conservatives and against the hardliners. And maybe try to come to more concessions and meet them somewhere middle ground. And I also wanted to point out to the issue of social media, which is really important, believe it or not, for the young Iranians, for the constituency. They're entrepreneurs who use social media to do business. Social media is the tool for free expression, for getting all kinds of information because of the limitations that are put on media inside Iran. And there is you see the clear division of power when you look at the issue of social media. So right now, as we speak, the Rouhani administration and the hardliners are still in this constant pull and push on whether to, for example, ban Telegram permanently, put it right next to Twitter and Facebook that has been banned since 2009.
Sorry, can you just explain what Telegram is?
Sure. Telegram, which a lot of people don't even know here, is this messaging app, instant messaging app that gives you some other features like a public channel and media. And because Facebook and Twitter and some of these other social networks have been filtered by the Iranian government since 2009. So for example, in 2009, protesters mainly used Facebook and some Twitter. Because those have been banned and filters, Iranians took to other channels, basically modifying them to their own needs. So you see an average Iranian getting their daily news, daily information, daily analysis on this messaging app, Telegram. There's 40 million cell phone users, as it was mentioned, and it played a really important role, this social network, in mobilizing and in organizing, and that's why it was quickly filtered. But it's something that the conservatives want to make permanent, and it seems like the moderates are still pushing to at least keep it temporary and then reopen it back for the young constituency that voted for them 6 months ago.
Can I just quickly add on Telegram? It should be noted, since we're bringing it up, it's a Russian-controlled, Russian-owned, and I don't want to go there, but...
The founder is Russian.
Well, the fact that the Minister of Communication in Iran can directly get in touch with the CEO of Telegram and say, I want you to shut down Telegram, and they do it, tells you why they prefer Telegram over Facebook. But anyway.
It's a little concerning because he's
If
based
I may,
in Berlin, actually.
The founder of Telegram did not shut Telegram. They just shut one channel on Telegram.
Well, yes, that's
For
true,
Because
but-
the
instigating
Iranian
violence.
authorities
That's
said that it's spreading, it's calling for violence. It wasn't the whole Telegram. The whole Telegram was filtered by Iran, not by Durov, the founder of Telegram.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is that they have their favorite social, providers out there, and the Americans are not top of the list. I'm talking about the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, but really, Telegram is not Russia-based, and I think the founder, Pavel Durov, even tweeted about it a few days ago. I'm just trying to find his tweet. here. Not sure why some media would refer to Telegram as Russia-based. We have no servers, no developers, no companies, bank accounts, or offices in that country.
That is because the owner was originally Russian, and then he fled the
And
country,
he had to
as it's
leave
now
the
based in
country.
the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah. Yes, and there's been pressure actually from Iran on Telegram to bring its servers into the country in Iran for greater control, but I think Telegram has been resisting so far.
Ishaan, can I just make two
Sure.
quick points about this Telegram and social media issue? Because over the past days, I've seen a very heated debate between the hardliners and also the Rouhani government about how to control or monitor the online media. The hardliners, both clerics and very hardliner conservative politicians, they're arguing that we should emulate the China model. We should have our own internet browsers. We should have our own messaging applications, so we can, first of all, at the time of unrest, can control it better, and at the same time to reduce the possibility of infiltration by Western powers. And second point I wanted to make was about your question about the U.S. messaging, that its impact on the Iranian government and people. While I agree with Golnaz that the United States should voice support for the rights of peaceful demonstrators in Iran, but the impact of those expression of support can be much more if they come through multilateral statements, especially jointly with the European partners. The problem is that the uncertainty surrounding the nuclear deal has made the Europeans very much cautious about siding with Washington, even on the issues that they are on the same page with Washington, because they fear that Washington might use those issues as a pretext to cancel the nuclear deal. So for any messaging and also support for the Iranian people, and also to pressure the government not to crack down with repression against the protesters, and also about the thousands of protesters who are reportedly in prison in Iran, that they should be released, they should not be subjected to torture. It's important to have the support of the European allies, because the Rouhani government especially is very sensitive to those reactions. And if the pressure only comes from the United States, then that will not be that effective. We saw recently that Nikki Haley, the US Permanent Representative to the UN, he convened a session about the Iranian protests and about human rights issues, but the European diplomats instead use a lot of time to defend the JCPOA there. So we see that, that this uncertainty surrounding the JCPOA is isolating somehow Washington, and it's benefiting the regime in Tehran.
Terrific. I think we have a half an hour or so for questions from the audience. I'd love to get some voices in. There's a mic going around. Please, when I call on you, please introduce yourself and keep your comments limited to a brief question. Thank you. The gentleman here on the side.
Hello, thank you for your remarks. Is this on? Here we go. Rich Kramer from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. I have a question in respect to some remarks made by Ms. Mortazavi and Alex. Alex, you characterized Rouhani and his relationship with the IRGC as being at best tenuous, that they haven't been able to trust him. He hasn't been able to engender that. Ms. Mortazavi, you mentioned that possibly going forward, Rouhani may have some cards to play vis-a-vis those who backed him on the streets. It strikes me that that support from the streets may be very tenuous, particularly as we saw the number of those in Tehran and elsewhere previously associated with reformist movements that did not turn out. So I guess my question for the panel is, to what extent is Rouhani becoming increasingly isolated? Does he really even have that much leverage going forward in the short term? Thank you.
Great. Negar, you want to take that first?
Yes, so the dissent on the street is actually part of it aimed against Rouhani, but because the economy and the political situation is the main driving force, what I meant is that he could use that as a bargaining chip, being like this, there's serious dissent within the population, so we have to make some changes and we have to do certain things. That part of it was actually his promises that the hardliners and the conservatives don't give him enough power to do. And on the issue of IRGC and the budget, I also wanted to mention that since Rouhani came into power, to some extent, he's been trying to limit the economic stronghold of the IRGC. There's been a lot of tension in that area, and also the budget that has been put forth was one of the more transparent budgets put forth by an administration, which in a way, it worked as a disservice to himself, because people saw all of these foundations, of all of these institutions, religious entities that get very high budgets, don't really respond to the population. Some of them don't even pay taxes. They're soaking up the finances of the country. Then put that next to, as it was mentioned, foreign policy. There are chants saying, leave Syria, think about us, no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, only to Iran. All of these are basically an indication of an angry population that feels like there are resources, but they're being spent elsewhere and not for the improvement of their livelihoods. And if Rouhani can play smart, he might be able to somehow channel that into a power for himself against the hardliners, but we're still not sure if that will happen.
I would probably argue that Rouhani is pretty smart, but I also argue he's historically beholden to the man that is his boss. I mean, if you go back to the late 70s, who's the first individual that brings Rouhani, the young Rouhani, into the Defense Council and gives him a job? It's Khamenei. So you can't forget personal history like that. So he knows that the two men have wandered off, and later on he became Rafsanjani's student as opposed to Khamenei's. But Khamenei was the first entrance point for Rouhani into the Islamic Republic. I think that matters. It also matters that whatever they have in terms of differences of opinion about the Revolutionary Guards, they know if the radicals on the street level take over, they're all out of a job. There will be no Islamic Republic. There will be no supreme leadership. There will be no President Rouhani. So in that sense, they have something in common, in the sense that they want to keep the regime in place, but there's a difference of opinion clearly about how you best do that. I think Rouhani, the candidate, knows what he needs to do. Whenever he runs for office, he's openly said, how can we have a state within a state that has access to politics, media, guns, money, and you name it? That's the IRGC, to have access to all those items. IRGC is the state within the state. And Rouhani knows it, but he's trying to sort of see if he can go about it, convince them that, look, what I'm arguing is for the benefit of all of us. You cannot take the money and go to Syria or go to Yemen or go somewhere else and train thousands and thousands of Shia clergymen when we have young that are totally detached from the system. And this is the point I made earlier. The detachment between the people and the ruling elite has never been this great, because there's a generational shift coming through the pipes. And I just don't know if the Ayatollahs in Iran know what's going to hit them. Just take today's Friday prayer in Tehran, what he said. After what we just witnessed on our TV screens the last 2 weeks, he comes out and asks for more money for seminaries. I'm not against seminaries, but I'm saying that's not where the people of Iran want to go. Have seminaries once you've taken care of the economic issues, and the regime just does not seem to have a blueprint. Final point, Ishaan, about Rouhani being detached personally. He rules over the oldest cabinet in the history of the Islamic Republic, the wealthiest cabinet in the Islamic Republic. There is a sense that he's not from the people. He's an elite mullah, elite cleric. Ahmadinejad used to hit him, well, he's kind of quiet now, but Ahmadinejad can afford to do that sort of thing because he was an outsider who came in, and look where he is, they put him aside. Rouhani was never an outsider. And that's always been his challenge. How do you shake the system up when you're really inherently an insider yourself?
Thank you. More questions, please. The lady in the back.
So my name is Fariba Pajou, and actually it's not a comment. It's not a question, it's a comment. And first of all, I want to mention that I have been in prison in Iran almost 6 months in solitary confinement. So I'm not going to support regime here. But Mr. Majidyar, you mentioned that European, during last demonstration, European just talking about Iran deal, the Iranian called Barjam. But I think it's so important for Iranian right now and the reformist government, Hassan Rouhani in Iran. And on the other hand, it is important who is supporting the demonstrator people in in Iran, who in the U.S. Mr. Trump, who made the travel ban on Iranian like 6 months ago, and he called Iranian terrorist nation in the UN, who is trying to support Iranian demonstrators in Iran. And when I remember I have been in Iran myself, and I was reporting demonstration in 2009. Because of that, I have in prison. So I remember some people in Tehran streets called that Obama, Obama, ya ba ina, ya Obama. It means that Obama, you have to with us or with them. I mean, the government or what, demonstrators. So, but in this time, I mean, people didn't wait for the Trump, support. So it is very important who is going to support Iranian. Thank you.
Very briefly. About the Iran deal, my point was not that the Trump administration should cancel the deal. I was arguing quite against that because this uncertainty surrounding that has been a major distraction, and it also, Washington has lost the support of its close allies in Europe. But about the travel ban, over the past 2 weeks, whether in my own interviews with the media or my talks with people in the government, I've suggested that it is the best time that the U.S. should exclude the Iranians from the travel ban. I'm against all the travel ban, but against particularly about the Iranians, because that will be a very strong message that the Trump administration can show to the Iranian people that it is making a distinction between the Iranian people and the Iranian regime, because the Iranian leaders have been using this very repeatedly, saying that President Trump has called the Iranian people a terrorist nation. They have included Iranians in the travel ban. So it's not against, America is not just against the regime, but it's also against the whole entirety of the Iranian people. So that would deprive the regime from that narrative that it's using. So that will be very effective. And of course, I think everybody here supports that.
The gentleman, oh, sorry. Yes, in the front first.
In all of this discussion, which I find very enlightening, and I'm very ignorant on the subject, I've heard very little between the religious aspects, Shia, Sunni, and I'm wondering, as we talk about the motivations, the Saudis and their interest in this, I'm wondering if it's to support the royal family's interests and to remain in power, as I'm interested in the Iranian hierarchy, the guards' interest in remaining their economic interests. How much of the Sunni Shia factor plays a role in all of this, or is it all economic?
Alex, what are the Saudis thinking when they see these scenes of protest in Iran?
The only country that really came out publicly supported the protesters, obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech from Israel, and that was not a surprise. On the Gulf side, on the Arab side of the Gulf, you have had much more restraint on the part of the typical rivals of Iran, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. How do we explain that? Maybe that's just good neighborly conduct, but I think everybody knows that I think the rivals of Iran on the southern shores of the Persian Gulf are happy to see the Iranian regime, if you will, get a bloody nose. But I also think they have questions about what this means if this continues, this sort of people power taking over in a country like Iran, because it might have regional ramifications, obviously. I don't think necessarily in the smaller Gulf states they fear same situations could happen in their societies, that their people will rise up. Because, there is this general divide between those ruled and the ruling elite across the Middle East. But some of these countries have more resources at their disposal to keep the peace than others. Saudi Arabia, I think, is one of those countries that needs to start thinking about, whether they can pay for all the things they're doing right now, because they do engage in similar activities, certainly at a regional level as the Iranians have done, and that's not cheap. So maybe they will have a moment here of sort of soul-searching of their own. But on the Sunni Shia thing, I say this, which is very refreshing. Iran has about a 10% Sunni minority across some of the provinces in Baluchistan, Kurdistan, and so on. This was not a factor in these latest protests. The sectarian issue was not a factor. Ethnic issues were not a factor, right? Back in 1979, when you had a bit of moment of anarchy immediately after the fall of the Shah, the first places to go up and seek to break away from Tehran or become militant were the Kurds, were the Baluch, were the Turkmen. Not this time around. This time around, it's about the idea that Islamic Republic doesn't represent me as an Iranian, irrespective of what I am in terms of my sectarian ethnic background. I think that's really refreshing. And when I hear people sometimes in this town write op-eds about shipping arms to the opposition so they can protect themselves or fight against the central government of Iran, I could not think of a worse idea than shipping arms into Iran right now. Because once you do that, it's guaranteed the Islamic Republic will have the upper hand and the morale, if you want, to say, we'll go in and we'll defeat these people that are armed. So please, if anybody's out there thinking of writing op-eds about arms into Iran, it's not a good idea. The state is far stronger than you think, but you can attack the state because it's got serious legitimacy issues across the board in its society.
The op-ed has been written in Israel already. I just wanted to add a point about the Saudi involvement on social media. So we saw official statements coming from the U.S. and Israel, and not from the Gulf, but there was a very strong social media presence from the Gulf region, mainly Saudi Arabia, who were active and basically fueling the anger on social media or covering or mobilizing the protests, which has been something that we see as a trend in recent years. It's just an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, and if I may just quickly add that in addition to the Sunnis, even in the social media, I saw a lot of discussion and debate amongst regional Shiite communities. For example, in Iraq, of course, some of the Iran-sponsored units within the Popular Mobilization Forces, their commanders and leaders came in very strong support of the Iranian regime, and they followed the same line and describing the protests as a foreign-backed conspiracy. But at the same time, because the Iraqi Shiite communities are very diverse in their politics and also their worldview. So, for example, one Iraqi Shiite commentator that I noticed that he was raising the question that, okay, usually the Islamic Republic and its allies in the region, they are talking about defending the oppressed, especially the Shiites around the region. So what are they doing, their allies now in Iraq, in Iran? Are they siding with the regime about the crackdown of the protesters, some of whom, most of them are Shiites indeed? So that has generated discussions amongst even the Shiite communities in the region about what's happening in Iran.
The gentleman here in the center.
Thank you, Van Ram from NIU. First of all, my thanks for an outstanding tour d'horizon of the recent events in Iran. Very, very helpful for all of us, I think. In terms of drilling down, as Paul Salem noted, to get granular, I just thought of asking a bit about something that I think Ms. Mortazavi mentioned in terms of fraud. Alex, you talked about the corruption. There was this grandmother in Mashhad, that has been quoted quite often as saying she lost her life savings from these financial institutions. And so my question is, what do we know about those kinds of institutions? What are people using them to hedge their life savings and to plan against the rampant inflation and so forth, so we can understand a little bit more about what's going on in terms of the economic front?
Golnaz, would you like to answer that question? Oh. Apparently not. No.
Should I can go while you wait.
Well, we can. Yes. Negar, go ahead.
So yes, that's a great point. There's this group or class of people actually called Malbakhtagan who lost their funds, who sometimes put their life savings, and not just working class or the impoverished, middle class people who literally sold their business or the restaurant or the house and put all their money into these financial institutions, banks even, over the past decade, and we're basically living off the interest, the high interest rate. All of a sudden, that collapsed. Together with the austerity measures of the government, some of these institutions turned out to be fraudulent, or they had to be closed off, including some of the banks. And that has created a very strange class or group of people who you can't call them the angry working class, you can't call them from the rural areas. They're all over, including in Mashhad, which is a big center for what that happened, and that's why they were able to become so radical and angry in these mobilizing of the protests. So that's definitely one part of it. It has to do with the fraud and corruption and wrong economic policies. But then put that together with other portions of the population who are angry at the political and economic situation. Some even, I want to say, some even social and cultural. Alex mentioned concerts being banned in Mashhad. You don't even have to be a secular anti-regime person for your music or film to be banned. You can just be your average religious or traditional Iranian who wants to listen to a certain type of music, it's banned. Who wants to go to a concert, it's banned. Who wants to watch a film. Over the years, and that's just added to the anger of this population against the main establishment.
I just add very quickly, the trickle-down economics is not working. You know, just this month, I believe, for the first time, you will have more than just one bank issuing mortgages in Iran. So imagine, up until now, a country of 80 million people, one bank could issue mortgages. A young country, one bank. Just imagine what that means, the control they have, and how the politics and the economics of the country are intertwined. But I mean, to a larger point that you make, I said before, if I was in the business of policy prescription, I would say no arms to Iran, let them figure it out peacefully or without arms. But there are things the United States can do. And one of the things the United States can do, if President Trump is willing to reframe his Iran strategy, because frankly, he's been in office for a year, and his Iran policy is still a campaign pledge. I don't see a sign of a strategy. It's airing grievances. Those are legitimate grievances, but that's not a substitute for policy. He can reframe his Iran policy. One of the things he can do is allow the likes of Apple and Google to help Iranian population to have access to information. Because with access to information, you can ask for accountability. Right now, the stuff that we have seen the last month, anger about how much the religious institutions are getting or how much Revolutionary Guards are getting. This data that has upset so many people came not from the people, came from the government. This is as much as they were willing to share with us. And look how upset we got. Just imagine if power were empowered to find out what is really happening with their money. Why is it pensioners have to beg for their own savings? And that's something the United States can do. That will win the hearts and minds of ordinary Iranians. And amidst, I hope the travel ban will be forgotten, but that's a different story.
Yeah, and the investment schemes are not just like a very recent problem. That started under the Ahmadinejad, part of his privatization policies. It was called privatization, but much of the state-owned assets actually went to the IRGC owned or IRGC affiliated companies. So they have been offering like incredible profit rewards up to between even some of them 25 to 30%, much more than, for example, other government banks are offering. So many of them have closed, many of them have announced bankruptcy, and those people that Negar rightly mentioned that have not only invested their savings, but also have sold their own properties and assets to gain profit from that, they have lost their money. So they are now actually in debt. And those companies, because many of them, they belong to the IRGC, then the government cannot just hold them also to account.
Hi, Golnaz, we have you back, right? There was a question about the fraudulent financial schemes that have cheated so many Iranians of their savings or sources of livelihood. And I think the questioner wanted to understand a bit more about the nature of these practices in the Iranian economy and society at large. The panelists here have talked about it a bit. If there's anything else you'd love to add, please.
No, I
jump
heard
in.
what Ahmed said, and I agree. They make huge profits. I know lots of people who
leave their money with these companies and get like in return, I think 25, I've heard even 30%. The Wall Street Journal had a good report that came out, I think, today or last night about that the collapse of some of these institutions being one of the reasons behind this protest. But I don't have any other insight into these firms. And I'm not sure about the connection with the IRGC. So.
Okay, great. We have just 10 minutes, so let's get 2 or 3 questions in, and then the gentleman in the back, and then the 2 ladies in front of him.
This question is kind of for the panel.
And sorry, please identify yourself.
Sorry, my name's Mike. I'm a consultant here. Every president looking at the history of the Islamic Republic, every president has left office either in battle, disgrace, all the way from Bani Sadr all the way to Ahmadinejad. To what extent do you think that this sort of protest movement is sort of the beginning of the campaign by the state to sort of disgrace or discredit moderates?
Okay, great. Let's get a couple more questions.
Hi, my name is Shabnam Mojtahedi, and my question is about the activist community, at least those that still are in Tehran that didn't leave after 2009. Has there been, I know that wasn't the center of the protests, have there been any discussions, because that is one of the limitations of that community is, of course, being in somewhat of a bubble. Has this spurred on discussions and debates about reaching out to working class communities in other parts, provinces of Iran, and what's that debate happening among that liberal urban elite in Tehran?
Great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tara, and I'm a student in California. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how communities around the world have responded to the demonstrations, who's leading these demonstrations and what their interests might be, and then how they might support movements for change in Iran in ways that couldn't happen after 2009.
Let's get another question, and if there's any more. The gentleman, oh, sorry, in the front. Yep. Sorry. Sending you running around.
Mohammed from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. My question was, like, in 2009, we have seen major protest in Islamic Republic, and now not as major as it was in 2009, but again, not a small one this time. Is it a new normal in Iran, and where it's leading the Islamic Republic, and what could be the next instigator of a major protest like this?
Terrific. We have a bunch of, let's get one more question. I think there's one that I ignored in the middle there. And then we'll do a wrap up from there.
Vince Alfaso, consultant. I've seen a lot of, I think Negar touched a lot about the social media aspect. But I do have just 2 brief questions. One is, how are Iranian Americans welcoming these, or are Iranian Americans welcoming these protests? I mean, you know, there are a large amount of Iranian Americans in Los Angeles, even in the DC area. My second question is, what tools do the youth of Iran have? You know, they're incredibly intelligent people with master's degrees, PhD degrees, who are advanced in IT, technology, business, mathematics, and we've also seen, you know, what kind of impact do living standards have? I mean, some of the, you know, I mean, I think in 2010, Ahmadinejad passed the subsidy reform plan, where it was going to booster the industrial sector and help the lower income, but that didn't really happen. And I think one of the things that gives me hope in the Middle East region is the younger people, especially in Iran and in Saudi Arabia. Even though we have these geopolitical differences, what kind of tools do younger Iranians have to build on change, to get into the workforce where they can use their skills to help the country? Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. This has been a lovely set of questions. I think I'll sculpt a couple of them together so we can get as many quick responses from our panel. So there have been 2 questions about the diaspora and the role of Iranians elsewhere in responding to these protests. Negar or Golnaz, would one of you guys want to talk about it?
Sure. Go ahead, Golnaz.
Sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted to talk about the diaspora here in the U.S. First, there's a strong presence by the People's Mujahideen Khalq that Golnaz also mentioned. A very strong opposition, used to be armed even on the U.S. terrorist list. Here in the U.S., they've really embraced the protests and have tried to, as some reformists even might call it, jumped on the bandwagon. There's also the monarchist political dissident group here in the U.S., the Crown Prince, the son of the late Shah Reza Pahlavi, who's also been very vocal in trying to support the protesters. It seems like the stronger opposition or the regime change type, also in Europe, have been quick to embrace these protests. The reformists or the moderates, going back to your question also about activists on the ground, were reluctant or more careful at the beginning, but I think there's a very interesting debate that already started within their community, that even if we as a political elite are not part of these protests, even if we're not joining them on the streets for different reasons, we should still acknowledge the grievances that are genuine. We should acknowledge the right to dissent, even if it's angry, even if it gets violent sometimes. But then there's also this issue that as political elite, the reformists are trying to somehow provide or help open channels, which is something you also see in the Rouhani government coming out for dissent, because that's one of the major issues. There's all these problems and people don't have channels to vent their anger or to show dissent. So now there's talks of creating public spaces and parks or in green areas in different cities for people to actually come out and protest, which comes to your question of, is this going to be a normal? Maybe, and maybe it will be even endorsed and supported by certain portions of the establishment. But that is also something that has created a debate, and the reformers are were really reluctant and then not sure how to come out, but then some started putting out statements acknowledging people's grievances and especially their right to opposition and to protest.
If I may, very briefly, I've talked to people in Europe and the US who were hesitant to join these demonstrations in support of the protesters in Iran because of the MEK, because this is a group that is very much disliked by the majority of Iranians. They sided with Saddam Hussein during the war, the bloody war with Iraq, and Iranians don't like this group, and they don't have much support inside, very little support outside and inside the country. So that's one of the main reasons. I think there was a question also about how to support Iranians. I think the best way would be to lift the travel ban and also give Iranians scholarship, let them leave the country, come and study in the US, and give awards to those human rights activists inside the country, highlight their work. Don't forget what they're doing, and don't be silent in the face of the violence they're facing from the Iranian government. The other question was about when is the next protest is likely to happen. We don't know. Iranians are very unpredictable, and I think it's better not to make any predictions. But as I said, there's a lot of frustration and anger in the society, and it's going to explode again one day, maybe in a few days, in a few weeks, or in a few years. I don't know.
What do you guys want to add?
Sure. I'd like to just briefly talk about the youth issues, because it is a very major problem for the Islamic Republic. More than 70% of the Iranian population, they are born after the 79 revolution. So they do not identify themselves with those ideals. They have no memories of the revolution or even the monarchy that preceded it. And they have very high expectations. They want a more modern life. They are much better connected with the outside world than the previous generation. And the regime, of course, the Islamic Republic has changed over the past 4 decades, but the pace of change has not been in tandem with the expectations that those youth have. And in relation to the comparison that you made with Saudi Arabia, I think that the Crown Prince bin Salman, he has acknowledged that, and that's why he wants to create that kind of base amongst the youth and just meet those expectations. How much he would be successful, I think that remains just a question. But we don't see that kind of intention inside the Islamic Republic, although some people in the Rouhani government and even some conservatives, even Soleimani is talking about it, but we don't see any concrete actions to take. So that's why I think that the frustration of the youth and also women, because if you compare Iranian women to women in many of the regional countries, they have more representation in the workforce. The number of women are more in Iranian universities than men, for example. So they also have a lot of expectations, but unfortunately just the regime does not facilitate that. So those problems will only grow and not decrease. And in terms of the protests that when they might resurface, I think we all mentioned that those underlying problems still exist and they could resurface in different forms. But let's not forget that before these protests, there were local province and also at provincial level in many Iranian regions. One BBC Persian survey found out, recently published, said that 90% of the cities and towns that experienced protests in the past 2 weeks, actually they experienced some level of protest over the past 6 months. So we had protests by the union workers, by both from the reformists and conservatives. So the problem was there. And when they will resurface, I think that the biggest challenge for the regime would be when Supreme Leader dies, because he is playing this balance between different power centers and he has kept some stability. But once he's gone, I think that the problem will become much worse.
I'll make 2 quick points. I mean, this last week or so, we've seen a video from Ayatollah Khamenei when he was president in the early 80s give a speech to a large group of people saying, whenever your government doesn't deliver for you, you have the right to come out and protest. That's your God-given right. That video has to be played again and again and again. That's exactly what's happening. I mean, that's how you keep this alive. This is a leaderless opposition. You did not hear the names Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Garoubi, a green opposition movement, because those individuals from 2009 have been overtaken by events. There's a new demographic reality on the ground that's radical, doesn't want to try reform as such anymore, because reform wasn't taking them anywhere. They tried reform, they repeatedly tried reform, they repeatedly said we don't want to have to come to the street level, but Ayatollah Khamenei has persistently wanted to be the only voice that can really call the shots. And I think that needs to be challenged. And one of the trends we've seen is this mobilization around the idea of a referendum. It's very powerful. Imagine a referendum, simple referendum. What kind of system do you want? Do you want the Islamic Republic? Do you want a supreme leadership? Because you can have that legitimately raised in society, have that referendum. And even if you don't have the referendum, you have a powerful idea, can keep the momentum going forward, because the momentum being lost is a key challenge for the opposition. But my hopefulness about Iran goes back to the fact that this is a country, when it was named Persia back in 1906, had the first constitutional revolution anywhere in Asia, before Japan, before anybody else. So this is a people coming from a rich civil society. You've heard about some of the features. So they will be active, regardless of what the regime does. If the regime walks away too far away from them, they will remind the regime that they're there to serve the people. That's the challenge for Khamenei. I'm doubtful he's going to be able to hear that voice, or his advisors will keep him from hearing it. But unless he can do something on that, he might just as well be the last supreme leader in the history of the Iranian nation. But anyway, with that, I stop.
I think that's a very provocative and interesting note on which to end. Thank you all so much. And thanks to my panel, Negar and Golnaz and Alex and Ahmed. And thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.